Hello and welcome to Lost Love Chronicles.
Amanda Thurgood wrapped her jacket tighter around her shoulders and hunched into the wind. The guardhouse at the entrance of the gated community now looming tall and imposing above her tiny figure. A tired old man, chunky, with only a small gray fringe of hair encircling a round, red face, stood and lumbered toward a small sliding window on the side of the building. His face flashed from annoyance to wonderment to sympathy, all in short order as she drew nearer. Without a word, he jerked his finger to one side, pointing her toward a door near the back, then turned and waddled toward it. Amanda's teeth were chattering and her fingers numb with cold as she waited for a catch to slide before he opened the door. "What are you doing walking way out here in this?" "This?" he stammered. Then his eyes looked at the gray clouds morphing and taking on eerie shapes as they raced over the whipping, twisted branches of the red-leaved maples lining the road. After a moment, his voice long gone in the screeching gusts, he seemed to remember her. With an impatient jerk of his arm, he motioned her inside. Amanda slid past, taking in the exterior. It was warm, and she immediately felt pin pricks on her cheeks and hands as the blood returned to the surface. "Lord Almighty, girl," the man said after pushing the door closed. "You're looking to get just plain blown away or something?" She only hunched tighter into her jacket, willing the warmth to return and end the violent chattering of her teeth. Now looking flustered and uncomfortable, the old guard teetered back and forth on his hips toward a coffee maker sitting on a small, beat-up table in the corner of the room. Yes, she thought, as she watched him pour a cup of coffee, he doesn't waddle. He teeters back and forth like his hips are all given out and need replacing. That just reminded her of her grandfather, though, and she fought to banish the thoughts from her mind. "Drink this," he said, thrusting a tall mug of steaming coffee in front of her. Unhuddling, she reached her hands out, wrapped them around the hot mug, and said, "Thanks, mister." He motioned her to a chair next to a small space heater. "What are you doing way out here in this weather? Dressed like that?" His eyes took in her thin, worn jacket and secondhand slacks with obvious disdain, but his features softened as he met her eyes. I have an appointment," she stuttered through still chattering teeth. "Mrs. Roberts." His eyes narrowed. "Senator Roberts's Mrs.?" She nodded. His lips trembled and his face took on a look that Amanda couldn't place. After a moment, though, he turned back to her and spoke in a softer voice. "Where you from, child?" "Nashville. How'd you get all the way out here?" "It's gotta be a couple miles from Franklin, and I know you didn't take a cab or a bus." "Walked." He sagged. "What you need to see Mrs. Roberts for?" "A job," she said, looking down at her shoes and hoping the scuffed black leather wouldn't make a bad first impression. "What kind of job?" "Maid," she said. "The agency sent me out here. Say she needs a housekeeper. And she knows you're coming?" "Yes." He reached over for his clipboard, picked it up, and scanned over the sheet of paper there. With a frown, he put the clipboard down and looked back at her. "You were supposed to be there nearly an hour ago." Fighting to control her frustration at the reasons for her tardiness, Amanda could only mumble, "I know." The guard didn't seem to know what to say or do. He fidgeted in his chair, looked at her, then over her shoulder with trepidation, then back to her again. "If you could just point out which house it is," she said. "I'm warm enough now." He sighed, then looked back at something over her shoulder and made his decision. "It's that one. The big stone house atop the hill over there." She turned and looked over her shoulder. It was maybe 300 yards away, sitting tall and imposing atop the small rise at the end of the subdivision. Standing, she took a long gulp of the coffee, not bothered as it burned from her lips all the way into her belly. "Much obliged, mister," she said, then reached out to hand the mug to him. That seemed to jolt him from whatever thoughts were racing through his mind. He stood, fumbled with his hands, and finally took the mug from her, spilling some of the remaining contents onto the cement floor as he did so. "I expect I'll be back this way in short order," Amanda said, forcing a smile to her lips. The guard looked at her long and hard, his face getting serious. "You be careful up there, you hear?" She gave him a quizzical look, and his features seemed to flicker. "Just be careful," he said again, teetering over to the door and opening it for her. She was barely back out into the angry weather, her eyes now focused on the tall, stone house when the door slammed behind her with a whoosh and slapping thud. Unnerved, she jumped, pressing her lips together and again hunching into her tired jacket and leaning into the wind. She began the long march to Mrs. Barbara Roberts, praying the whole time she'd not be cast out at first glance. From within the house, standing behind a window on the corner of the second floor, a figure stood watching as the girls stepped outside the shack and began the journey up the hill. An hour's worth of frustration and disappointment were washed away in an instant, replaced in short order by satisfaction, then anger at her tardiness. "About time," the voice behind her said, amused and eager at the same time. "Better late than never," Barbara replied, and then turned to make her way downstairs. "David," Alan Cameron barked, making Robert stiffen behind his desk. "Are you listening to a thing I'm saying here?" "Sorry, Alan. My mind's a million miles away lately." He turned his head from the window to face the tall, patrician figure of his esteemed colleague from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. "Barbara again?" Cameron asked, his voice softening while his features remained the same. Roberts hesitated, then sighed and said, "Yeah. Still not over your boy moving up to Illinois?" "Something like that. When's the last time you saw her? Went home and just spent a quiet weekend around the house for a change?" Roberts fought to suppress the shudder rising as he pictured being alone with Barbara in their house. The very image almost made him nauseous. He'd been angry at first, furious even, right after it had all come out about how she'd all but starved his grandson. The grandson he'd fought to forget, but at least tried to support, tried to do right by. She'd never backed down, though. "That little witch is the reason Stevie's dead," she'd hissed at him. "Did you honestly think I'd go along with you in rewarding her for that?" But it wasn't her fault, Roberts had pleaded with her, trying to get her to accept the reality she'd long before chosen to ignore. "Stevie brutalized that girl, Barbara. Don't you see that? And he's our grandson. Ours, mine and yours. How could you do that to him of all people? An innocent child?" She'd only glared at him, then gotten a wicked grin and laughed. "You pathetic scumsucker. You're just like Mark. You're just as weak and spineless and do-gooding as that little." Her anger was maniacal to the point that words couldn't come, and Roberts had just shaken his head and walked away. Reasoning with her was useless. He wasn't sure even then that he had any energy to even go through the motions. "She's changed, Alan," he finally said. "How so?" "Stevie. She just can't let him go." "But he's been dead for, what, 8, 9 years? How could she just now be changing?" "I'm not sure it's just happening now," Roberts said, then leaned over and slid open his bottom drawer to pull out 2 heavy crystal tumblers and a bottle of bourbon. "Ice." Cameron shook his head. Roberts poured them both a healthy dose and slid one across the desk. "You know what it's like," Roberts continued after the first sip washed through his throat. "We're here most of the time. When we're not, we're campaigning or taking investigatory junkets or meeting with lobbyists or attending fundraisers and parades and church suppers. When are we ever really home?" "Yeah, but you've been here now what? Going on 20 years, right?" Roberts nodded. "About that. But the kids were always with her before. The first 10 or 11 years she had them around, and we were all pretty much together most weekends. Then they both went off to college. She still had Stevie pretty close by, and Mark was around during the summers. After Stevie died, though, Mark pretty much quit coming back during the summers. He stayed up there in Chicago playing in that band. Didn't come home much except Christmas. Not even Thanksgiving. And then, when Stevie died, well, I guess I just wasn't there as much as I should have been. Why don't you move her here? To Washington?" Cameron suggested. "She'd probably love Alexandria. Hell, the countryside's almost exactly like your Tennessee home, isn't it?" "She'd never come," Roberts said, then turned his chair and looked back outside at the passers-by on the mall below. "Won't leave that house where Stevie grew up, where his room's still just the way it was." "What about Mark? You think maybe he can help?" "They had a falling out. He won't speak to her. Hell, he barely speaks to me." He heard Senator Cameron twitch in his chair. "What happened?" "I guess I wasn't much of a father." "How so?" "Let's just leave it at that. Suffice it to say he has every right to stay away. I'd probably do the same thing in his shoes." "Sorry to hear that," Yeah, me too. But, can't you? Have you thought about counseling? Getting her to see a therapist? Won't go. I tried, but she refuses. So what is it? She won't leave the house anymore. As in she won't come here? As in won't step out the front door, Alan. Or at least leave the property, but usually won't even go outside. Have you tried getting someone to come in to see her? If she won't see them, maybe you can get them to go to her. Won't work. You've tried? Just trust me, Robert said, defeat slumping his shoulders. It'd be a disaster. So what are you going to do? I don't know, he said. I really just don't know anymore. Cameron fidgeted in his seat, and Roberts knew this was going to take a different direction. Just say it, he urged. The leadership sent me here, David, Cameron started. He gulped down the rest of his bourbon before continuing. You haven't been back to Tennessee more than 5 times in the past year. They want to know if this is your last run. Roberts didn't hesitate. Tell him to start finding the replacement. How soon? I mean, are you gonna? I know what you mean. And yes, it could be pretty soon. Sorry to hear that, he said, his face inscrutable. You think it'll be soon? Why? Truelson's second term's up next year, he said. He'll replace you with one of our own. After that, well, we're getting pensive, to say the least. I'll think it over and let you know, okay? Cameron smiled. Roberts knew he appreciated the skullduggery involved. Roberts wanted to control his successor, and hanging his resignation date over everyone's head was the best way to do it. Fair enough, he said, standing to leave. Roberts just turned back to the window, again lost in his thoughts. Amanda had worried the whole long walk up that hill to the big house at the end. As she neared it, she could see the mottled blue grays of the stonework in stark contrast to the white shutters on the gables and the steep, slate-gray roof. Even in this enclave of enormous, imposing dwellings, this house seemed to stand guardian over them all like a stern sergeant with a stern, glowering gaze. Amanda fought the dread rising within her, chilling her still more. She thought of a lyric from an old Nirvana song. I gazed a gazeless stare. That's what the mansion reminded her of. This gargantuan, gray building more resembled a mausoleum than a mansion. It seemed dead and foreboding. Climbing the stairs to the oaken front door, she lifted the brass knocker and gave 3 tentative raps, almost hoping she'd missed her appointment and no one would answer. The door opened quietly, though, and a tall, ramrod straight woman looked down her nose at Amanda. She was almost impossibly thin, dressed in a long black skirt and long-sleeved white blouse buttoned to her neck. Her shoulder-length hair was colored a frosted blonde, the perfect complement to her pale blue eyes. The most striking feature, though, was her skin. Her face seemed chiseled from flawless, unblemished milky white marble. Cold. You're late. Amanda's teeth chattered as she tried to think of something to say. The impassive porcelain face, though, told her that no words would undo this inexcusable delay. After a slight pause, the woman stood aside and waved Amanda within. You're the girl they've sent? She snapped. Yes, ma'am. Your name, child? She demanded. My name is Amanda, ma'am. Amanda Thurgood. The woman's lips curled upward without smiling as she repeated, Amanda Thurgood. A very pretty name. At that, she turned and strode down the wide, dim hallway toward the back of the house. Amanda followed, her eyes taking in the wide oak staircase leading upstairs and a formal dining room with tall, heavy chairs around an enormous table, large enough to seat at least 20. Beyond that, Amanda entered the kitchen, her eyes taking a moment to adjust to the sudden burst of bright light. Sit there, Amanda, the woman instructed. Amanda sat at a small table in the corner of the kitchen, and the woman sat opposite her. I'm Barbara Roberts, the woman confirmed for Amanda. You will call me Mrs. Roberts or ma'am. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, Amanda said. A smile played over Barbara's lips. Very good. You learn quickly, my dear. Thank you, ma'am. Her eyebrows went up on her high forehead, and she snapped, But you mustn't speak unless spoken to. Do you understand? Amanda hesitated, then nodded and said, Yes, ma'am. My husband is David Roberts. You will address him as Senator or Sir. Barbara looked at her, waiting for a response, but Amanda said nothing. After a moment, and with a smile of smug self-satisfaction, Barbara said, "Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. Everyone else our guests you will simply address as sir or ma'am." Barbara stood, surveying the kitchen as if for the first time. "Can you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. The last one couldn't cook. That's why you've been hired." She turned and stared at Amanda. "I prefer simple food. Soup and salad. Maybe a piece of fruit after dinner. Can you handle that?" "Yes, ma'am." The senator prefers simple food also, but he prefers steaks, chops, and roasts, usually with potatoes and vegetables. "You can prepare these as well?" "Yes, ma'am." "Fine. Please come with me." Amanda was guided throughout the house, from room to room and cupboard to closet. The function, contents, and instructions for each rattled off in a non-stop litany of instructions and demands. Nearly done, she stopped outside the two far doors at the end of the hallway farthest from the master bedroom suite. "This will be your room," Barbara said. She flipped the lock below the old brass doorknob, swung the door open, and stepped back. "You may place your things in here for now." Looking at Amanda, though, the woman's eyes narrowed and her face got stern. "You've brought your things, didn't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, show them to me, child," she demanded, her impatience rising. Amanda pulled her hand from inside her coat and held up a small, white plastic shopping bag. "Walmart," it said in faded blue ink. "That's it." "Yes, ma'am," Amanda said. "They said, well..." Amanda looked to the ground, waiting to be corrected for speaking. "Out with it." "Who said what?" "They said I'd only need..." "They said you'd be supplying uniforms? And that's the rest of it? That's all you've got?" The blood rose with Amanda's humiliation, the burning heat in her flushed skin driving the chill from her bones once and for all. "Give it here," Barbara said. Amanda began to hold the bag toward her, but Barbara's hand swooped in and snatched it before it had moved an inch. Looking inside, she frowned and muttered, "This won't do. Not at all. Not even. This just won't do." Barbara's head turned to the side, and Amanda was afraid that her few pairs of old, graying underwear and 3 best sets of nylons, along with basic toiletries, had somehow ruined her chance at a home and a job for the first time in months. Her stomach growled for the meal it would soon be missing, again, over something as simple as her underwear? Really? Amanda thought, watching Barbara stalk down the hall. Trotting to catch up, she heard Barbara muttering under her breath, "He'll never accept this. Never. This is first on the list." Amanda wasn't sure what, or who, the woman was talking about. As they turned to descend the stairway, Amanda said, "If you want me to get different ones, I will. I can get them just as soon as I get paid. I promise." "Quiet," she snapped in response. "I'll take care of this myself." "Yes, ma'am." Following her into the kitchen, she watched as Barbara grabbed a phone and punched the keypad with such force she thought for a moment it would disintegrate in the woman's hand. "Yes, Charles, I need you to do me a favor, please," she said into the phone, her voice suddenly sickly sweet. "You remember a few months ago when I had you go out and purchase the ladies' undergarments?" "Exactly. Yes, I know. This is the second one in 4 months. I don't know where they find them. You'll do that then?" She turned and looked at Amanda, then turned back and said into the phone, "Yes, dear. Definitely small. And definitely B cup. 34 B cup. You'll do that for me? You're a darling. Of course we're still on for tomorrow night. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Yes, I'll see you tomorrow morning then." She hung up the phone, turned, and stepped on the foot pedal of the trash can. Holding the bag away from her as if it was contaminated, she dropped it into the garbage and then turned to Amanda. "All the toiletries you need are already in your bathroom. You'll find your uniforms hanging in your closet, and we'll have new undergarments delivered in the morning. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Amanda said, relief washing over her and pushing the confusion aside. "Thank you, ma'am. You can thank me by going upstairs this instant and getting into the shower. Wash your hair long and hard, and scrub yourself thoroughly, understood?" "Yes, understood, ma'am." "You may then relax the rest of the evening, get settled in, and make yourself familiar. I'll be dining out tonight, and there's food in the refrigerator. You may help yourself. You will, of course, clean up after yourself." There's a television in your room. You may borrow a book from the library if you wish. Just remember to put it back when you're done. And you may not read it in the library either. When you're not working, you should restrict yourself to your room or the kitchen." Her eyes narrowed and she gave Amanda a long, hard look, her eyes sweeping over Amanda's body from head to toe. "Do you understand all of this?" "I do, yes ma'am." "Very well," she said, turning and picking up some mail on the countertop. "You may go." Amanda turned to leave, already looking forward to the long hot shower, when she was stopped by her new employer's icy cold tone. "Just one final thing, Amanda." Amanda turned and looked at her, the face in front of her now cold and menacing. Amanda cringed, feeling a chill race from her shoulders to her lower back. "The room across the hall from yours," Barbara Roberts said, her lips twisting as she spoke. "You will never, under any circumstances, go into that room. Is that understood? Never. It is strictly off limits, and I will know if you've been there. Am I making myself clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am." With that, Barbara once again turned her back and flipped through her correspondence. Amanda was frozen for a moment. Then, fighting to keep herself from running, she made her way out of the kitchen and toward the stairs, seeking the comfort and quiet, soothing privacy of a long, hot shower. "She's very pretty," he observed. "So you're pleased?" "Very pleased." "She's not too plain? I mean, she looked like a ragamuffin. Those clothes and that underwear." Her nose pinched at the memory. He gave a light laugh. "The clothes don't matter much. She'll have uniforms when she's working and little else when she's not. Besides, Charles has great taste in women's undergarments. Really great taste." "So you're pleased," she said, enjoying the relish in his voice as he talked about her. "Good. Know what's better?" he asked. "What's that, dear?" "She's flat-ass broke. I mean, you see her? Not a penny to her name." He chuckled. "Hell, her underwear had to be what, 4 years old? From Walmart? Hell, does their stuff even last 4 years?" "Do you suddenly have a taste for the other side of the tracks, dear?" she said, a genuine smile creasing her lips. "Doesn't matter where they come from," he said. "What matters is that this one won't be in any position to run off like the last two did. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever," Barbara said. "Exactly," he concurred. "Still, you've got to make sure. Tonight." "Of course," she assured him. Then, against her wishes, an involuntary shiver went up Barbara Roberts' spine at the sadistic glee in his voice. She still didn't understand, but this was her only way to keep him near. The only way to keep him from abandoning her like all of the other men in her life had. Amanda felt rejuvenated after her shower. Rather than putting on her raggedy old underwear, she looked through the closet and dresser in her room. There were several pairs of soft gray sweatpants and some baggy, hooded Northwestern law sweatshirts. She pulled them on, then sat on her bed and looked around. The knock on the door startled her, and she watched as it opened and Barbara Roberts entered. The look on her face seemed a tentative attempt at warmth. "Amanda, dear," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I forgot to tell you something today." She looked at Amanda, waiting for a response, but Amanda remembered the test earlier in the day and remained silent, her hands folded on her lap. A cloud passed over Barbara's face, but was then replaced with the same forced smile with the slightest hint of teeth, which reminded Amanda of a wolf's snarl. "I see you found some clothes to wear." Before she could keep it in, Amanda blurted, "I'm sorry. I thought it was." "Of course it's okay, dear. You need to wear something when you're not working, and you certainly didn't bring any clothes with you, now did you?" "No, ma'am," she mumbled. "And thanks." "Thank you," Barbara corrected. "Thanks is too common. You must say thank you." "Yes, ma'am," she said, her eyes on her lap. "Thank you. That's better. Now, the reason I came here was to tell you something I forgot earlier. At night, before bed, I usually take a tea with brandy and lemon in the library. 8 o'clock. I ask that you join me for that so we can review the day and go over anything that will need to be done. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Then I'll see you tonight." 8 o'clock, Amanda confirmed. She shut the door, and Amanda waited to hear her footsteps retreat down the hallway. Instead, she heard a click as the door across the hallway was unlocked. Then she heard voices, but she couldn't make out the words. There seemed to be two of them, but Amanda couldn't tell. A few minutes later, the door across the hallway closed and Amanda heard the click as it was locked. Who else lives here? She thought. Barbara was surprised. When at 7:15, Amanda slipped into the kitchen. "You're early," she said. "I thought you wanted me to make the tea. Do you know how to make tea, dear?" The girl flinched. "Not really." Barbara smiled. "Come here and I'll show you. I'll make the tea at night. I don't expect you to do that, but you'll be expected to prepare it during the day as the mood strikes me. You might as well learn to do it right." "Thank you, ma'am." Barbara went through the routine of making loose leaf tea. 4 minutes, Amanda. Not a second more, nor a second less. 4 minutes for the perfect tea. Understand? "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said. Once the tea was complete, she placed the cups and saucers on a tray with lemon and said, "Please bring the tray to the library." Amanda did as she was told. Once there, Barbara waved to a chair and, her back to Amanda, poured something. Amanda assumed brandy in each. "Here you go, dear," Barbara said, passing a cup and saucer out to Amanda before settling herself into the deep leather chair opposite the girl. "You already know what needs to be done tomorrow, right?" "Yes, ma'am." She smiled. "Good. Then tonight, I want you to tell me a little bit about yourself." "About myself?" the girl said. "Yes. You know, your past. Were you married? Where were you raised? Do you have a family? Things like that." Amanda hesitated, her face giving a fleeting look of fear before changing to hesitation and embarrassment. Her eyes dropped to stare at the cup of tea, and her words were so soft they could barely be heard. "Don't have no family," she started. "My folks were divorced, and Daddy ran off with another woman when I was little." Barbara fought the urge to correct the girl's grammar, a fight helped by the joy of what she was hearing. "Haven't seen him since I was 10 or 11, Amanda continued after a moment. "Mama died a couple years later, when I was 13. The cancer ate her away there toward the end." "Oh, you poor child," Barbara said, masking her smile as she sipped her tea. Amanda sipped her tea also, and made a small face. "Take the lemon peel and rub it around the edge," Barbara encouraged her. "It will make the tea taste far better." The girl did as she was told, then took another sip. She didn't make a face this time, but took another, deeper sip. "This is very good," she said. "You've never had it before?" "No, ma'am." Barbara was pleased. This was going to be easy. "Go on, child. Where did you go after your mother died?" "My brothers went to live with some cousins in Kansas. They couldn't take me, though, so I stayed with my grandpa." "Where?" "Chattanooga." "And he took care of you?" She hesitated. "Mostly, but it was real hard sometimes. Grandma was gone by then, and he was all alone. There wasn't enough money, and he took to drinking sometimes when the black moods came over him. But he tried his best, I guess. I mean, there really wasn't much choice, was there? For either of us." "No, dear, there wasn't." Amanda gulped the rest of her tea and then looked at Barbara, shame washing over her face as she saw Barbara still had half a glass. "Sorry, ma'am, but it's real good." "Don't be embarrassed, dear," Barbara reassured her with glee. "You can have 2 per night. No more, though, or you won't sleep well and you'll be useless to me the next day." Amanda nodded in relief. She put the saucer and cup on the end table next to the chair. "So did you have any boyfriends? A husband? My goodness, how old are you?" "I'm 24, she said. "And yes, there was a boy, Clint. We were engaged." Her eyes got a faraway look, and Barbara knew she was picturing him. "We were gonna get married. Then he joined the army so he could get money for college. He was smart, but he came from the same kind of home I came from. They didn't have much money, so they couldn't help him." A tear started to trickle down Amanda's cheek, but she didn't seem to notice. Instead, her jaw clamped shut and trembled as her eyes glistened. "Was it one of the wars, dear?" She nodded, and her voice was scratchy when she spoke. "Iraq, a month before he was supposed to come back home." Barbara felt a chink in her armor, her heart going out to the poor girl. Then, in a flash, she remembered the purpose of this, and she stood. "Let me make you another tea, dear," she said, picking up her cup and saucer. When Amanda started to rise to follow her, she said, "You just sit back down and try to relax. I'll be right back. He was there when she got to the kitchen, his face a sinister smile. She's perfect. Barbara's sympathy for the girl was forgotten, and she smiled back at him. She sure seems to be. Seems to be? Oh no, this is the best one yet. She'll have to stay. She's got nowhere else to go. No matter what happens, she's all alone. She can't run off because she's got nowhere to run off to. You're pleased, Barbara observed. He rubbed his hands together. Damn straight I'm pleased. We're gonna start tonight. You don't think it's too soon? The key is starting slowly, he said, his eyes picturing it as he verbalized his plan. Not too much too soon. Still, it should start right away. Once we really get her there, she'll be used to it. Think it's expected of her. He flashed a broad grin of dripping teeth. Look forward to it, even. Barbara was pleased with herself, but only in that he was pleased. Then her sympathy came back, as did her revulsion at his tastes and urges. Still, if this was the cost of keeping him near, she'd gladly help him as much as he demanded. After Amanda settled down, she thought she heard voices coming from the kitchen. After a moment, her curiosity got the better of her, and she made her way slowly on stocking feet toward the bright entry. "Oh," Barbara said upon seeing her, the surprise causing her to nearly drop the saucer and teacup in her hand. "Whatever are you doing, child?" Amanda bit her lip and said, "I wanted to help." Barbara's face relaxed, the tight smile replaced with a patronizing look. "No need. I told you I would get it." They walked back to the library, and once again, Barbara added brandy to the tea with her back to Amanda. This time took a moment longer than before, but Amanda's mind didn't process it as she waited for sounds from the kitchen. "What are you looking at, dear?" Barbara said, suddenly looming in front of her and holding out the fresh drink. "I'm sorry," she replied. "I was just thinking. You are feeling better, I hope?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "You're welcome," Barbara said, giving a furtive glance toward the kitchen before resuming her seat. Taking a sip, her eyes narrowed as she looked at Amanda. "This may be a bit forward, Amanda." What I'm about to ask you, dear." She took another sip, placed the teacup on the end table, and sat back in her chair. "You may not understand why I need to ask, so I'm going to explain it to you before I do." "All right," Amanda said, her eyes falling to the teacup as she rubbed a lemon rind around and around the rim. "As you know, my husband is a very powerful man. With that power comes responsibility, too. The responsibility to be above suspicion of anything. Do you understand?" "I think so. I will make it clear. There can be no scandal even remotely associated with the senator. None whatsoever, not in his life or in mine. And that includes this house and the people who live in and work for us. Now do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Amanda said. "Good, because I would never ask this of anyone unless it was so important." She took a sip of her tea, and Amanda used the brief respite to take a longer drink of her tea also. The cup still in her hand, Barbara said, "Are you still a virgin, dear?" Amanda choked as her tea went down the wrong pipe. Then fear, embarrassment, and shock all coursed through her veins at the same time, flushing her cheeks. "You can be honest," Barbara said. "No judgment will be made. This is, after all, the 21st century. But we need to know if any problems from your past will arise." Amanda relaxed, but then felt herself sag again at the thought. "No," she whispered. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but me and Clint, we couldn't wait until we were married and all. We decided not to wait is all." "My goodness, child, how long has he been gone?" A faraway smile came over her face. "I last saw him just over 3 years ago. He died about a year and a half back." "And there's been no one else?" "No, ma'am," she said, the smile trembling and her eyes dropping to her lap. "You must be so lonely." "I get by." "I'm sorry if this has been hard on you," Barbara said, her voice softening. Amanda hadn't heard this tone before from the woman. It was almost as if she cared. "Would you like to call a friend tonight? Maybe your grandfather?" "He died too," Amanda said, "little over a year ago. His liver." Looking back up, she was confused to see Barbara's smile disappear to a look of concern. A smile? She'd seen it. The woman had been happy at the answers. But how? What kind of woman was she working for? And living with? Pat, this is David. David Roberts. David, he exclaimed. Long time no see. How are you keeping yourself? That's why I'm calling, actually. Oh, yeah, it's Barbara, Pat. What about her? You or Deborah seen her lately? We ain't seen hide nor hair of her in months, actually. Deborah was just mentioning that the other night. That's why I'm worried, Pat. I think she's really falling apart. Haven't you seen her? Not in several months, I'm sorry to say. Why not? It's been difficult. Ever since last year, she's really taken a turn for the worse. And every time I come home, it just seems to get worse. She gets worse just by me being there. How so? The anger, Pat. All the time. And she makes it clear as a bell. She can't wait for me to leave. Maybe she should see someone. She won't. I've tried, but she refuses. Truelson said nothing to that. After a moment, Roberts continued, Listen, I know how busy y'all are down there, and I know I may be a skin a lot. Still, if you or Deborah could find some time to maybe drop in on her and let me know how she's getting along, I'd really appreciate it. Truelson sighed through the phone and said, Of course, David. You know we will. I'll do it myself, and I'll make sure Deborah drops by, too. Thanks, Pat. Roberts was about to hang up when Truelson stopped him. You hear from them, David? Roberts sighed, then said, Not directly, no. Deborah's really hurting here. We all are. We gotta think of something here. Other than just give him more time, Pat, I'm not really sure what we can do. The ball's in their court. I know it was wrong, David. Fine, I can see that now. But your boy got his revenge. Does he really have to take away our only daughter, too? I don't think it's about that, Pat. Then why? I think he's afraid. Her too. Maybe. Definitely him. Afraid of what? Of letting us back into their lives. Afraid we'll meddle and manipulate them again. But we won't. Tell him that. I've tried, but he just hangs up on me. And Sandy refuses to pass along messages. Refuses to even say anything other than they're doing fine and they're happy. Hell, she didn't even tell me about the pregnancy. You did. For Christ's sake. Yeah, it hurts. Trust me, I know. But you'll keep trying? Truelson begged. You know I will, Roberts promised. Thanks. Yeah, Roberts said, and hung up the phone. You're back, Amanda said, watching as he hovered over her bed and ran his fingertips along her t-shirt. I always promised I'd be back, didn't I? But I thought you were gone for good, she said. Kilt over there in Iraq. Amanda, he said, and she could see the white teeth in his smile beneath the shadows of his face. I always told you we'd be together forever. Mandy, she corrected. Only Grandpa calls me Amanda, Clint. You know that, baby. I know, honey. His fingertips brushed over the thin layer of fabric covering her dugs, twirling lazy circles. She felt her dugs enlarge with her arousal. It's been so long, Clint. Too long. Yes, way too long, baby. But now I'm back. You promise? You know I do. I was so scared. Don't be. I told you I'm back, and I'm never gonna leave you again. What's that? She said, her eyes trying to focus on the silvery glint in his left hand. Remember when we always talked about shaving you down there? No, I don't. You don't remember? Don't remember promising you'd try it? See if you liked it? I don't remember, baby. I remember, he said, anticipation in his voice. Anything to make me happy. That's what you said. You sure you don't remember? She bit her lip, her eyes trying to focus on his face, but only seeing the gleaming white of his smile and the maroon jacket with white sleeves and lettering. Where'd you get that coat? She asked. I've always had it. I don't remember it. He pinched her dugs, and the jolt of pleasure made her forget what she was saying. You're gonna like this, he said, his hands sliding down to her waist and pulling her panties down. You gonna kiss me down there, she said, raising her hips to help him along. Not tonight, Mandy. Tonight we're just gonna do this, okay? And if I let you, then you'll kiss me down there? If you're a good little girl, then I'll kiss you down there. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, the darkness again overtaking her. The alarm went off like an explosion, the tiny clapper banging against the bells so loudly She feared the whole neighborhood would wake up. Sliding out of bed, she padded to the restroom to pee. Her eyes didn't register the sink as she passed, but her brain did. When she pulled her panties down to her knees, she gasped. She was bare, shaved totally bare down there. Her pink lips exposed to her astonished eyes with nary a covering of hair. Her eyes shot back to the sink. It was her razor, the one she'd used in the shower yesterday to shave her legs. It was lying inside the sink bowl alongside a small bottle of skin lotion, and all amidst the damp remains of her pubic hairs. Then she remembered her dream. She remembered Clint coming back to her again. Had she done this in her dream? She didn't remember it, that was for sure. Yet, she'd done strange things like this before. She remembered way back all those years before, way back when Mom died and she'd first moved in with Grandpa. She'd had strange dreams, haunting dreams, for weeks. One night, she'd even cleaned out Mr. Wiggles' litter box and put the crusty nuggets on the kitchen table. Grandpa woke her up during that one, terrifying her into shrieks and screams until she'd realized it was all a dream. Then she'd seen the poop on the table and the scoop in her hand. She wouldn't have believed it if she hadn't seen it. Still, the next morning it all seemed like a dream all over again, and Grandpa had never brought it up, not even once. But she knew it hadn't been a dream. Now she realized she'd done the same thing all over again. A whole mix of things had drawn her to it: the brandy, the new job, the strange, severe lady in this drafty old house, the conversation about Clint and sex and how long it had been since she had done it. Amanda felt a wave of relief pass over her skin and through her limbs. Sure, that's all it was, just a silly old dream and some sleepwalking. Then she looked back down at herself. With a tentative poke, she felt the smooth skin all around her nubbin. Looks kinda cute, she decided. Maybe I'll just stay with this for a while longer. She sat on the toilet to relieve herself, smiling at the wicked little thoughts dancing in her head. Barbara was sitting on the sun patio, sipping her tea while reading the paper. The tea was good, brewed to the perfect strength. She's a fast learner, Barbara said to him, putting the teacup down. Maybe she'll be able to keep up with the household after all. He chuckled. I'll have her whistling while she works. Guaranteed. So there were no problems last night? Not a bit. Except he called her Mandy. Only her dear old grandpa called her Amanda. Well, how was I supposed to find that out? She said, perturbed at the tone in his voice. Just remember, he said, his voice lightening again already. It's all in the details. But you enjoyed yourself? For sure. And her? Fell asleep. Still, what there was, she definitely enjoyed. Good. Just like that other witch, he snapped. She enjoyed it too. Maybe I just didn't pay her enough. Maybe that's why she... Not that one. You know who I mean. Her. The witch. Oh, Barbara said, sipping her coffee while he settled down. She wanted it. All along. Just teasing it all right out there in front of me. I know. I didn't assault her, Mom, Stevie said. I know, dear, she purred. She wanted it. Really, she did. Barbara heard footsteps coming through the kitchen and shushed him. Yes, dear, she said. There's a Mr. Truelson here to see you, ma'am, Amanda said. Governor Truelson, Barbara corrected. My goodness, child. Don't you read the papers? Keep up with the news? She lowered her head and said, sorry, ma'am. I hope you were polite. The girl said nothing, and Barbara stood and swept past her toward the foyer. Why, Governor Truelson, she said upon rounding the corner. Barbara, he replied, holding his arms out toward her. We go back way too far for you to be going all formal on me now. She leaned in and gave him a light peck on the cheek. Of course, Pat. It's wonderful to see you again, he stammered, and then said, David wanted me to call on you, Barb. See how you're holding up? She fought to suppress her emotions. I'm just fine, Pat. She turned, spotting Amanda hovering in the kitchen door. Dear, would you bring Governor Truelson a cup of coffee and some of those rolls? The girl disappeared, and Barbara turned back to Truelson. She wasn't frightfully rude, I hope? He smiled. No, of course not. She was just fine. Then his eyes went over her shoulder and his head tilted. What is it, dear? She asked, but he didn't reply. Instead, his eyes stayed on the doorway, and when Barbara heard footsteps, she saw his eyes widen. My God, he said. He looked down at her as if for the first time. Then his eyes cleared, and he gave a brief shake to his head. A wide smile split his face, the smile Barbara knew by heart. That politician's smile that said, "Trust me," when it was really saying, "You poor, dumb sap." "Really?" Barbara insisted. "What is it?" "Just thought I recognized her is all," he said. "From where?" "Probably just a waitress or something at one of the hundreds of shindigs I'm constantly attending. You know how it is. We have to keep our memory for faces fresh and all. Politician's best friend." She knew he was lying, and she knew what he saw. She'd warned him before that this wasn't smart, but he'd insisted and she'd gone along. "Well, why don't you come out to the sun porch with me?" she said, hooking her arm in his. "Of course," he replied, walking with her. 20 minutes and 2 sweet rolls later, Truelson was gone. Barbara stood on the front porch waving as he departed in his black, chauffeured limousine. She needed to restrict her visitors, but wasn't sure how to go about it. This one could be the one, she knew, and she needed the time to finish reeling Amanda in. Still, staying in her home and cutting off everyone else would only raise the red flags higher, and she couldn't afford that now, either. Not after he'd finally come back to her for good. David Roberts made his way to the Avis counter, his mind in turmoil. As he waited in line, eager to get on the interstate and out to see his grandson, he activated his cell phone for the first time in 4 hours. He had 2 messages, both from Pat Truelson. Both were the same: "Call him immediately, if not sooner." "Pat, it's David." "Jesus, David, where you been?" "Decided to take off a day early and fly out to visit my grandson." Truelson hesitated, and when he spoke his voice was softer, hesitant. "You think you'll get a chance to see her, Sandy? To talk to her like you said?" "I'm gonna try. Really, I promise." "Call when you do," Truelson said. "Either way, just call." "I will." Truelson was silent, and Roberts had to prompt him back. "You said to call." "Oh yeah," he said, snapping back and his voice getting edgy. "I visited her this morning like I said I would. Barbara. I dropped in unannounced and visited with her. And? She's edgy, that's for sure. Like she couldn't wait to get rid of me. Yeah, that's how she's been with me too. Except she's been angry too. Real angry. I didn't get any of that. She was fine, all pleasant and what have you. But also in a hurry, like she couldn't wait for me to leave. Was there someone else there?" "That's the weird part, David," he said. "The really weird part." "What?" "She's hired another girl. Another maid. A live-in. I think she wants that now. Someone to keep her company." "Weirder than that, man." "How so?" "I didn't really notice it with the first 2, but with this one I noticed it big time. Then I remembered back to the other 2 that she's had in the past year and, well, it's definitely strange." "What did you notice?" David asked, drawing the words out and afraid to hear the answer. "They all bear more than just a passing resemblance to Sandy," he said. "Not exactly, not like sisters or anything, but they're all the same look, short, blonde, sort of perky looking in that high school cheerleader sort of way. And all right about the same age, or at least looking the same age as Sandy was when Stevie died." David tried to process this, stepping out of line to do so. He made his way to a quiet corner of the terminal, trying to remember what the maid had looked like the last time he'd been home. He'd only met one of them, and he wasn't even aware Barbara was now on her 3rd maid in the past year. Barbara had been apparently keeping everything from him, and he'd been more than happy to leave it at that. "You still there?" Truelson queried. "Still here," he said. "When did the second one leave?" "I'm not sure. I met the first one maybe 6 months ago, then the second one about 4 months ago. That time we dropped by and you were in town. Have there been others?" "Not a clue. Still, you've got to admit, it's pretty weird." "Yeah, to say the least, I think." "Anyway," Truelson said, and then let it hang there. Robert sighed. "I'll call you as soon as I know something up here. I think it's more important now than ever that I sit down with Mark." "You think he'll talk to you?" "I can only pray. Goes for both of us." Robert said nothing, and Truelson just disconnected after a few seconds. Barbara was pacing from room to room, her anxiety building. When the dull, brass knocker droned through the hallways, it was all she could do to keep from answering the door herself. Her body a bundle of nerves, she made her way to the sunroom and sat, her hands gripping the chair. A moment later, Amanda appeared and said, Mr. Truscott to see you, ma'am." Barbara's body sagged in relief, but she raised herself stiff again. "You may show him here." The girl disappeared, and a moment later reappeared with Charles Truscott in tow. "Charles," she said, standing and craning her neck. He gave a broad, too wide smile, kissed her cheek a moment longer than was tasteful, and said, "Barbara, my dear. Sorry I'm so late." She put on a fake pout to hide her anger and impatience, and then said, "And I thought you'd forgotten your promise." "Never," he said, holding 2 shopping bags toward her with a raised eyebrow. As Barbara took the packages from him, she saw his head turn and follow Amanda as she left the room. When he turned back, the leer was only beginning to disappear. "She's very beautiful," he observed. "Oh," said Barbara, looking through the apparel in the bags. "I hadn't noticed." "Really?" She could hear the amusement in his voice and gave him a stern stare. "I have no idea what thoughts are racing through that mind of yours, Charles, but I can assure you I only want the young lady to be properly attired and comfortable." "Of course," he agreed. Yet, his face made it clear he was intrigued by the prospects of his little trips for her. "Excuse me a moment," she said, walking past him toward the main hall. "Amanda, come here please." The girl appeared seconds later. "Yes, ma'am." "Here," she said, holding the bags out toward Amanda. "Take these and put them into your room, and change into a pair while you're up there. They're all matching sets." Amanda looked confused as she took the bags and gave a tentative look inside. When she saw what she was holding, her eyes got large. She looked back to Barbara and stammered, "Yes, ma'am." "But first," Barbara commanded, "you need to go to the sunroom and thank Mr. Truscott for picking them up for you." The girl's cheeks blushed a deep red at that. Unable to find words, she nodded and walked toward the sunroom to do as she was told. Amanda had the undergarments spread out before her on the bed. There were 8 pairs in all colors, all matching, and all silky and skimpy and lacy and like nothing Amanda had ever worn before. Running her fingers over a bright red bra and panties, she tried to figure out what this was about. Sure, her underwear had been old and worn, but it was kinky, strange, completely unforeseen. She unbuttoned her blouse and undid her graying bra, sliding it off her shoulders and putting on the yellow bra. It felt nice, exquisite even, like nothing she'd ever felt before except maybe for Clint's soft licks and feather kisses there. She tried to banish these thoughts from her mind as her dugs enlarged. Quickly shucking her pants, she replaced her underwear with the matching yellow silk bikini. Walking to the mirror, she looked at her image. Her eyes went wide at the sight of her tiny bottom now clad in the sexy underwear, at her jugs encased in the deliciously lewd bra. If only Clint could see me now, she thought. He'd be so turned on. Without thinking, her fingertips brushed over her mound. Her bare skin below rubbed against the silk panties and felt so. The sharp rap on the door brought her back to the present, and she scrambled to step away from the mirror and button her blouse as Barbara Roberts walked in. By the look on her face, the arched eyebrows and slight sly smile, Amanda knew her employer had seen through her. "So you like them?" she said. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I am glad." Amanda said nothing, just looked down for her gray slacks to put them back on. "Charles noted that you are a very beautiful young lady, Amanda," Barbara said. "I agree with him." Amanda hazarded a look at the woman as she pulled on her slacks. Barbara's expression was inscrutable. It could have been read so many different ways. Yet, there was a hunger there that Amanda had seen before, and she shivered at what the woman was thinking. "Anyway," Barbara continued, the sly smile returning, "Charles has insisted that I have dinner with him this evening. The price I have to pay for him to pick these up for you." "Yes, ma'am," Amanda managed. "Still, I will be home by 8 so we can have our tea in the library." "Yes, ma'am. And this should give you plenty of time to get the rest of the furniture polished as well." "I will." "I know you will," Barbara said, her face softening for a moment before it again froze in a mask. Without another word, she turned and left. Amanda paused, watching her go. After a moment, she zipped up her slacks and went back to her duties. her thoughts a maelstrom of conflicting emotions and questions. 3 hours later, she had still found no answers. Clarice Talbot answered her door, surprised. "I didn't expect you this weekend." "I know. Sorry, it was kind of a spur-of-the-moment thing." She gave a wan smile before stepping aside. "He's over at a friend's house," she said. "Suspected as much." She tilted her head, her eyes questioning, then said, "It's her, isn't it? You're Barbara." The nod was barely perceptible. "I think she's having a total breakdown. If she hasn't had one already, that is." "When's the last time you saw her?" "Couple months back." "You can't keep hiding from her. You know that, right? You've got to deal with this sooner or later, and it's only going to get worse." "I think I've made some decisions," he said. She waved him to the chair. At first, he fidgeted. Then he sat. "You can talk to me," she said, settling into the love seat across from him. "I don't really want to get you involved in this anymore. You don't need this." She smiled. A warm smile. A smile that put him at ease. "I'm doing a lot better now, Senator. Thanks to you. And to Mark and Sandy, too. None of this was your fault, what Stevie did to me, but you've all stepped to the plate in a pretty big way. It means a lot to Skylar. He's a whole lot happier now than he's ever been, and I've been. Well, that counselor you got me into has helped a lot. So if you need someone to talk to, and I'm pretty sure you do, then I want to help, okay?" He nodded and then sagged with the burden of it all. "It's all pretty much pop psychology on my part. Mostly guesses and suppositions. So what do you think is going on?" He looked at her, hesitated as he thought about how to put this softly, then just went ahead and said it. "I think she's regressing back to when he started, then caught himself and went on, back to when our son was killed. I think she snapped and can't admit it ever really happened. That's why she did everything she could to get back at you. I'm sorry, but I think she blamed you at first, and then did everything to put you out of her thoughts because it was just a reminder that he was gone." Clarice's lips tightened in anger when he mentioned Barbara blaming Stevie's death on her, and he could see her struggling to maintain her calm. "I didn't say it was logical," Roberts said. "It's not. None of it. I'm just saying that I think that's what's going on here." Then his eyes narrowed as he noticed Clarice, as if for the first time. After speaking with Truelson, it all suddenly made sense, and none of it made sense. "Your hair," he said. She looked perplexed. I've started letting it grow out. Robbie, my counselor, says I need to move on and get my life back. And you've put on a few pounds." She smiled. "It's not polite to discuss my weight." He shook his head. "It's not that. Yeah, you needed it. To put on a few pounds, that is. No, it's what you look like now." "And what's that?" "Sandy," he said. Then he spent the next 10 minutes telling her in detail about his conversation with Truelson and his recent history with his wife. When he was finished, Clarice could only say, "She's nuts. Totally nuts." Roberts flinched, having never heard such words pass Clarice's lips. Then he could only nod, agreeing with her, but pondering the new thoughts now tumbling into his brain. Was Barbara hiring maids who reminded her of Sandy, so she could pretend it had all never happened and Sandy was still a part of their lives? Worse, the one that made him shudder in fear. He wondered if Barbara was hiring girls who looked like Clarice and was thus using them as surrogates to punish in place of Clarice, the poor girl on whom she laid all of the blame for Stevie's death. "I've got to talk to Mark," he said, his lips tight. Clarice's lips tightened. "I'm still not too sure he's ready to have any meaningful contact, David. You've got to try," he begged her. "Please." She bit her lip, then stood and disappeared into the kitchen. He heard her talking on the phone, but couldn't make out the words. When she came back into the room, her face cheated nothing. "He's not home yet. Sandy said she'd try to get back to me. Will she talk to me? Sandy?" Clarice shook her head. She doesn't want to do anything that will cheat Mark, not even remotely. Seeing the look of panic on his face, she came over and kneeled next to him, putting her hand on his forearm. "You need to understand how tough it's been on them," she said, her eyes begging with him to understand. "Both of them. It hasn't been all sunshine and roses. They've had some real rocky patches since she came up here. They're settling down now, especially since she got pregnant. But there are still times when it's difficult. How so? She looked at him, her face full of conflict on how much to say. I can only say that there are still some real issues there. Sandy has to tread real carefully, or Mark can fly off the handle. How so? There can't be the slightest hint of manipulation in anything she does. It was real bad early on, but I think they're both dealing with it better. I'm sorry, he said, putting his hand atop hers. I know you're probably already saying more than you should. Still, I'm not really sure what you mean. The little things, she explained. All those things that would seem innocent enough in a normal marriage. They're all questionable now. If she offers something out of the blue, he wonders what she wants in return.